Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I will start off the presentation and then give the floor to Toby. We will alternate throughout the flow of the presentation. My name is Ghislaine Kiefer, and I work in IRENA, as Fernando introduced me. Okay, so I will start off the presentation by explaining a little bit how the idea for this report came about. Basically, we monitor, obviously, renewable energy development at IRENA, and we had noticed a growing number of renewable energy targets, and a growing number of our member countries were also asking us for advice on what are renewable energy targets and how, what is the best practice to set them. So the first thing that we noticed when we embarked on this study is that there is no set definition of renewable energy targets as a policy instrument. If you look at, if you do just a Google search, you will find a very diverse type of information, and as opposed to feed-in tariffs or net metering, for example, where the debate on and the specific features are discussed in a very detailed way on the topic of renewable energy targets. There wasn't really a defined universe. Second, what we found was that the process of setting or defining renewable energy targets is not a very scientific, step-by-step, well-defined process. In our analysis, we found that, in fact, there's not always a clear line between the process of setting and implementing the targets. Many times, targets are part of a broader policy package. Other times they are set at a very high level without being translated into specific actions. So that was where the study became interesting, is that we thought perhaps we can contribute a little bit more clarity as to what are renewable energy targets. To do so, we present a global overview of the diversity of renewable energy targets by bringing together insights from a wide range of countries from a policy design perspective, and this is important. We don't look at the implementation of targets, we don't rank countries. Our effort was mostly concentrated at identifying what are renewable energy targets and some of the key success factors in their design. And hopefully these findings will be useful for policymakers when they design targets or when they revise, because as Fernando mentioned in his introduction, today 164 countries have at least one renewable energy target, so many countries are also revising those. So just I put up the first slide of the presentation here. We will start with a short review of the literature on targets. It has some interesting elements of information. Then we will look very briefly at the history of renewable energy targets in the global energy landscape and how they have evolved in recent years. This will lead us to a discussion on the universe and definition of renewable energy targets. Toby will be talking about this. And then I will present to you some of the key rules and functions that we identified by drawing on a few country examples. And then I will give back the floor to Toby, who will present some specific design issues for policymakers to consider. And we will share with you some of the report's key findings and lessons. Okay, so now turning to the foundations of targets. Um, Targets have been used in the public and private spheres for many years, and there's a very abundant literature on the topic across several academic disciplines, be it economics or management literature. We found a lot. When you review the literature, there is often a debate whether targets are a means to achieve an objective or an end in itself. An end in themselves. And there's actually a very interesting literature on targets, goals gone wild. I think it was Toby sent me recently a very interesting article from Harvard showing how targets can derail when they're not designed properly, when they're not contextualized properly. It's the temptation of quantitative management. More recently, we can see the great mobilizing power of targets. And a very recent illustration is a couple of days back when the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations. These goals include 169 targets, which are meant to give more content and to give a time and a quantity dimension to the 17 development goals. So as we can see, the first thing that emerges is that targets have both a quantitative and a time dimension. Sometimes they can intrinsically represent overall goals and a hierarchy of objectives by providing a sense of purpose and direction for a particular sector. I give the example of the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many targets, for example, in the environmental spheres. We will talk a little bit about climate targets later in the report. So at the high level of international policy or development, targets are a very important aspect of the discussion to anchor the discussion. Going back to the theory, the theoretical foundation of targets, their origin is very often attributed to Peter Drucker in the 1950s and the concept of management by objectives. The management by objective conceptual framework was originally centered on efforts to make companies more efficient. This is post the Second World War. Assembly production and the idea of making industrial production and manufacturing production as efficient as possible. Underlying MBO theory is the assumption that it is possible to identify common goals across different individuals, which, when they're explicitly defined as targets, can harness collective efforts and produce more efficient results. Later on, the use of targets evolved, and the link between targets and public policies emerged in the 80s and 90s. The Thatcher government in the UK and the Reagan administration in the US promoted a series of reforms which are regrouped under the term the new public management, which aim to improve the performance of public sector organizations. One famous example is the US Government Performance and Results Act of 1993 in this case. The last point on this slide is the SMART acronym. It's very difficult to exactly trace who is the author of that acronym or concept. but it doesn't really matter. What matters are what the acronym means, and renewable energy targets. This is an important design principle, that they should be smart, as in specific, and one important aspect also in this case is the aspect of motivation, which is not always well captured. In the case of renewable energy target, this is a very important feature because they have an important role to mobilize all renewable energy stakeholders towards a common objective. Turning now to the evolution, the short history and the evolution of renewable energy targets. In fact, renewable energy targets found their origin in the context of the oil crisis of 1973, which triggered for many countries sort of awareness of the vital importance of energy security and, by extension, of energy policy. And in this period, we saw the emergence of many energy efficiency policies, as well as the incipient renewable energy policies. We mentioned in the report the two very important first targets in 1975, the pro-alcohol program in Brazil, and in 1984, the first electricity target set by the US state of Iowa. In 2005, 43 countries had renewable energy targets, mostly in OECD countries. If you look at the picture in 2015, actually this is 2014 data, or as of early 2015, 164 countries had renewable energy targets in place. And this time, you can see that the majority of the targets are in developing and emerging economies, who have taken a leading role in the growing adoption of targets, and now account for 131 of the 164. I will now turn to Toby. Oh, no, sorry, there's one more slide, which shows the evolution of targets by sector. This is an important aspect that we wanted to capture in the report. We didn't want to focus exclusively on electricity. Heat and transport are equally important to capture the growing adoption of renewable energy policies. And in this graph here, you can see very clearly the evolution of renewable energy targets across all three sectors. The number of countries setting targets for the heating and cooling sector saw a huge progression in the last 10 years, from 2 countries in 2005 to 47 by the middle of 2015. This can obviously be explained by the adoption of the European Union Renewable Energy Directive, which mandates specific renewable energy heating targets for all member states. And in part, it can also be explained by the proliferation of solar thermal targets in many countries. And the number of countries adopting transport targets has also grown steadily and has more than doubled from 27 in 2005 to 59 by mid-2015. What we saw in our analysis is that a growing number of countries have started to move beyond a sector-specific approach that focuses only or predominantly on electricity, and are applying their targets to their total energy mix, with the total number of countries adopting targets, renewable energy targets, as a share of either total primary energy supply or total final energy consumption, growing from 30 countries in 2005 to 79 as of mid-2015. While these overarching targets, as we call them in the report, are often combined with technology-specific targets, this trend is very important because it shows that policymakers are beginning to use renewable energy targets to induce structural changes in their total country energy mix rather than simply in one sector, either electricity or transportation, as this was the case in the past. I now turn to Toby.
Thanks, Guylaine, and good morning, everyone. As Guylaine was laying out, one of the things that we realized quite early on in diving into this research and into this analysis more in greater detail is that a lot of these distinctions had not yet really been clearly articulated or clearly delineated from one another. So there was some significant work that I've done on tracking generally the trends of renewable energy targets, but most of it was focused on the electricity sector. So this report really gave us a chance to try to lay out the full spectrum of renewable energy targets, including in particular these, what Guylaine just pointed out, the overarching renewable energy targets that apply to the entire energy mix. So I think as you look more deeply into targets themselves, you can see that there's also a significant difference not only in the target types, but also in the actual character of the targets. In many countries, the targets, when we started to look into what the actual target was, it was little more than a simple political announcement, or the president or the prime minister stood up and said, you know, we will reach a certain percentage by a certain date. And we tried to find a way to distinguish those simple sort of political announcements from the more legally binding kinds of targets that we find in the European Union, as well as in many US states in particular. So in the process, we developed this spectrum of renewable energy targets that you see on slide 7 that tries to capture that universe of targets from sort of political announcements on the one hand. The second is sort of energy strategies and scenarios, which captures integrated resource plans and similar kinds of planning efforts that involve some component of renewable energy in the modeling. And the third moves to something a little bit more defined, a little bit more specific, and in some cases a little bit more binding, such as national renewable energy action plans. So the third one really captures more fully developed plans and strategies, similar to what we see in India, similar to what we see in China, as well as in a number of West African countries that have just developed their own national renewable energy action plans. On the far right, you see the fourth category, which is, from all the research that we could find, represented sort of the most stringent, the most clearly defined, the most legally binding and measurable renewable energy targets. And those were found predominantly in countries like the US and the UK, where the actual obligation is legally binding and that there are clear penalties for failing to reach it. If you look back to numbers 1 and 2, and even in many cases number 3, there's no binding character to the target. It's just an announcement or an aspirational goal. And what's unique about this move towards number 3 here and number 4 is that targets start to become binding in nature. And that has significant implications for both for renewable energy investment and development, but also for the overall trajectory of the energy mix. It's very different to be operating in a jurisdiction that has a legally binding target than one that just has an aspirational target. So we tried to shed light on more of those distinctions, and you can find more on this in the actual report itself, which the link will be provided at the end. So moving to the next slide, we tried to rank some of the countries, or not rank, but organize the countries according to where they fell according to this spectrum. So whether they're number 1, 2, 3, or 4. And the size of the graph represents the overall magnitude of the target. And you can see here that countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, is somewhere between 1 and 2 in terms of how specific, measurable, and binding it is, while countries like Denmark, Germany, the UK, and Italy are on the far right in number 4. This graph captures or focuses on national level governments. It's also important not to forget that many targets exist at the subnational and even in many cases at the municipal level. So you can see here a spectrum, a way to organize targets based on how binding and specific they are. Moving to the next slide, number 9. You can see the distinction between the current target or the current energy mix and how ambitious the target is. So the different circles, the light and then on the inside and the dark on the outside, represents the difference between the current energy mix and what the target entails in terms of additional new renewable energy development, following the same spectrum that was laid out previously. So you can see that some countries like China have significant and quite ambitious renewable energy targets, not only in absolute terms, but also in terms relative to their current electricity mix. It gives a way to sort of capture, in a sense, and characterize the overall universe of renewable energy targets as we find it in the world today. So with that, I'll pass it on to Guylaine, who will go back and discuss a little bit more about what the roles and the functions of target setting are. And I think one of the things that people and analysts and policymakers and even investors often fail to understand or appreciate is the many different functions that renewable energy targets can play. It's not just about providing or setting expectations in the market. There's also, or even guiding the market, there's also a range of other sort of less obvious functions that come out when you really look more closely at what different stakeholders, what the impacts on different stakeholders are of renewable energy targets. So I'll pass it on to Guylaine.
Thank you, Toby. If you allow me, I just want to add just a couple of interesting trends in the bubble graph, as we call it, that shows the renewable energy electricity targets. This is a sample, obviously, of only 24 countries. As we said, there are 164 that have targets. Not all of those 164 are electricity targets, but out of those, what we try to do is also highlight some of the trends that we could see. And as you can see here, and Toby mentioned it, the majority of countries at the beginning, maybe back in the early 2000s, the majority of countries were very aspirational, very top-down. As time passes, and this is also a reflection of the growing complexity of renewable energy policies, they increasingly fall in the 3 and 4 categories, so with more specificity, more measurability. The binding aspect is the most tricky one, we recognize that. And the other thing that is also quite striking from this graph that we try to chart is that most of the targets fall in the 30 to 40% range. And we can see that two countries that have 30% targets, you can see the size of the bubble is quite different. Because, of course, they have to be brought back proportionally to the size of their electricity mix. And then we see a sort of glass ceiling. There are the targets above 40% are few, because these require very deep structural changes in countries. So maybe if we do an update of the report in 5 years, we will see this group of targets moving up in the 50% range, and the literature and the analysis of renewable energy in the renewable energy community will reflect increasingly already reflect these structural changes of renewable energy, and moving beyond just the electricity sector, but also the heat and the transport, which is the effort that we try to do in this report. Sorry for that short digression. So looking at the functions or the roles that targets play throughout the policy making cycle, we try to organize the different roles, and sorry, the separation is debatable, but it's meant for clarity. So if we separate the role of targets throughout the policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation stage, we can identify a few specific functions that renewable energy targets play. In the first stage of policy formulation, targets can play the role of exploration and an important knowledge function. For example, a key aspect of designing robust targets is the quality of information that underpins them. We see less and less targets that are very much detached from the reality of the energy sector of a country. Increasingly, those are based on more accurate energy statistics, a more detailed understanding of the country's technical and economic potential. And so the knowledge or information function of targets is very important in the definition stage. We can see that renewable energy targets are meeting multiple policy objectives of security, sustainability, and economic growth. It's very hard to try to prioritize what is the number one driver in many of the national renewable energy targets. In some cases, it's the job creation is an aspect that is put at the front of the debate on the targets. In other cases, it's to reduce import dependency. But what we see also in this policy formulation stage is that targets can help to balance the cost and benefits of setting the different level of the targets. This was very well documented in the case of the EU renewable energy targets, where there was a very detailed cost-benefit analysis made in order to support the decision to set the target at the 20% level. And deriving from this data gathering function, targets can also enhance the transparency of the policy-making process. And this is the case of South Africa. Integrated resource plan is a very interesting one. In 2010 and 2011, the South African Department of Energy undertook a broad consultation effort to further develop their integrated resource plan, which integrated renewable energy targets. So they created a web portal through which they disclose all the key documents. And following a first round of public consultations in June 2010, a second draft of the IRP was released in October and was open for comments for 60 days. In this plan, the original target was 11.4 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. The Department of Energy received over 200 written comments on the renewable energy parameters, which led to some of the model assumptions to be altered. One of the main changes was the inclusion of up-to-date learning rates for renewable energy technologies, making the costs lower over time. And as a result, the technology-specific renewable energy targets were increased to total 17.8 gigawatts by 2030. So the greater emphasis on renewable energy in the revised South African IRP was due in large part to the input of stakeholders and to the transparency of the target formulation process. And we can see that the target, in this case, is embedded into a broader plan. However, the focus on a specific quantitative and time dimension and, of course, the technology specificity enabled more focused interaction with the stakeholders. Now, when we look at the function of targets in the policy implementation stage, they obviously provide a clear policy direction, and they inform investment decision. When targets alone are not enough, and Toby, I think, said this, and this is a very important part of our analysis when we analyze targets. When they're backed by the supportive policy and investment framework, they can provide the long-term visibility to the industry, which is very important for investment to provide a sort of time dimension. Targets are also instrumental in indicating the trajectory of market growth. For example, some manufacturing plants producing renewable energy parts, I'm thinking, for example, of wind manufacturing plants, they can be in place for decades, and therefore they require a certain scale of the market in order to be profitable. As a result, investors, and you see a lot of the commentary on renewable energy targets is made by investors because they use this as one of their informational points to assess the market readiness of particular countries. And renewable energy targets can also facilitate the tracking of market development. This is very important because the numerical value that a renewable energy target can represent at an early stage of market development can be small due to a number of factors such as the immaturity of the market. In this phase of early market development, and I'm thinking, for example, here of the case of Chile, which originally had a target of 10% of renewables by 2025. This was set in 2008. And after less than 5 years, because the market grew very rapidly, the target was doubled to 20%. So by giving a sense of trajectory and growth, targets can help to bring down deployment costs. Of course, not in and of themselves. They just give the signal to the market, and they need to be backed by supportive investment and policy framework. And here in this case, a famous example is the example of India. I mentioned Chile, so there is abundant commentary on the recently announced 100 gigawatt solar target of India. This is a very clear example of market deployment and the target aiming to mobilize stakeholders and to give the scale of the market. And many people may be aware of the mega solar parks that are in the design phase right now. So the revision of the target is a clear example here at the policy implementation stage. And last but not least, the targets play a very important role also in the policy evaluation stage. As we saw, 164 countries have targets to date. Therefore, many of them are already in their second or third iteration of their targets. And in this case, the diagnosis of the performance of targets is very important because it can indicate whether policies have been effective or not, and it can help in this diagnosis function. I will now just illustrate that function with the case of the EU. And here, this is a graph taken from the IEA Energy Policy Review of the EU, published in 2014. So you can see the progress with the blue bars on as of 2012 data against the 2020 target. And another way to represent this is with this graph published by the Fraunhofer Institute, which also shows the progress to date against the envisioned trajectory to meet the 2020 target. I now hand over to Toby to focus a bit more specifically on the critical success factor in the design of targets.
Thanks, Gideon. So now we turn, after looking at the overall functions of renewable energy targets, the different roles they play and the different roles they can play. We're going to look more closely at the design of targets and some of the design features that go into making renewable energy targets effective. Every jurisdiction that adopts a renewable energy target wants them to succeed, wants them to be met on time, and for all the stakeholders to sort of enter into the picture and start contributing meaningfully towards the achievement of that target. In order to do that, the target needs to have a certain internal structure. It's not enough to just have, if you think back to our graph, our spectrum graph, on the one hand, on the left-hand side of the graph, it can be sufficient to have simply a numerical target or an objective. But as you move further and further to the right and your target becomes more and more specific and binding, it becomes necessary to give the target more structure. Both in terms of time, but also in terms of whether it's technology neutral or technology specific. So whether you have specific targets for wind power, specific targets for onshore versus offshore, specific targets for PV versus CSP, or for different bioenergy technologies, or in the case of the transport sector, for different biofuels, and so on. So targets develop more internal structure as they get more specific and binding. Another major distinction is between targets that are framed, what we've called the overarching targets, whether they're framed in terms of total final energy consumption or the total primary energy supply. That can have a significant impact on not only the overall size of the target, but also what that target means for different stakeholders. So the way the target is designed can significantly impact what the target actually means in terms of specific implementation and most notably in terms of actually achieving the target. The same point can be made for the third bullet here on the share of energy demand, or whether the target is framed as some fixed amount of energy. So we use here the electricity sector. In many cases, renewable energy targets are fixed as a percentage. So 30% of the electricity mix or 40% of the electricity mix. In some jurisdictions, targets have been fixed instead in actual generation terms. So some specific number of gigawatt hours, which is usually based on some forecast of future electricity demand or total future electricity generation in the jurisdiction. On the surface, that may not seem like an important distinction, but it can make a significant difference for investors and for particular entities that are required to meet those targets, like utilities, when the percentage forecast differs from the actual reality that that takes place. So for example, if the percentage was fixed at 30% and then electricity demand slows down significantly or demand growth slows down, the target may actually shrink in relation to what it would have been in absolute terms. So if it was fixed in specific number of gigawatt hours. At the end of the report, sort of looking over all the different examples, it's hard to say that there's one way that's decisively better or worse than the other. I think the goal of the report and our role is ultimately to point out that the difference can matter, and the policymakers should think more carefully about whether the target is framed in percentage terms or as some specific amount of renewable energy in the mix. And finally, a key distinction is obviously between whether the targets are set on the electricity sector, the heating sector, or the transport sector. And I think each of these has interesting and unique features and characteristics that we'll get into in a little bit of detail and that you can find a lot more information on in the report itself. Turning to the next slide, you can see here a quick snapshot of some different ways of designing RE targets around the world with specific examples. So covering the electricity sector, the transport sector, and the heating and cooling sector. And as you can see there, jurisdictions have approached this in a range of different ways, and it isn't clear that there's anything like the sort of best practices in this area, nor that anybody has really thought carefully about what a best practice might look like, whether governments should adopt certain types of targets over others. And I think this is one of the open research areas that probably needs to be looked at more carefully in the years ahead. Is what lessons can we draw, and can we do comparative analysis between different countries, the ways their targets were structured, and what impact those targets had on market development, on investor security, and so on. A few quick examples. You can see some targets are framed in units, so either units of liters of biofuels, for example, in the case of Uganda, or kilowatt hours in the case of Korea, which is cited here. Or it can be framed in sort of more abstract terms, like in the case of Spain, you can see that they have a solar hot water target and space heating in kilotons of oil equivalent. So it's very difficult to say that one of those is better than the other. It simply reflects the diversity and the considerable diversity of targets and the way that they're structured. So in thinking through the various ways that can be designed, it's almost analogous to a menu of options, and we tried to provide a snapshot of that menu in this table here. Moving to the next slide, as Guylaine pointed out at the beginning, targets can be ideally provide some kind of long-term trajectory for the evolution of the energy mix or the electricity mix, as the case may be. But often, targets have been, what we're seeing increasingly around the world, is that targets are anchored in shorter-term targets. So if there's a long-term 2030 target or a long-term 2050 target, as is the case in certain jurisdictions like Germany and Denmark, what we're seeing increasingly is that countries are establishing interim targets to sort of anchor the evolution of the mix, and also to provide an opportunity to update and review them and to provide some to make it easier to monitor and track over time. Another key distinction is between targets that are aspirational, sort of our political announcements that we discussed at the very beginning, and targets that are mandatory, or what we've called binding. And it's difficult to emphasize quite how important this distinction is based on the evidence that we have from markets around the world today. Aspirational targets in general have not been as effective and arguably nearly as effective as mandatory targets at actually triggering renewable energy investment and driving renewable energy market growth. So whether the target is binding or not matters, and there can be a significant difference in what we would call the overall credibility of the target. If investors or manufacturers or other people in the renewable energy industry don't believe that the target is credible, it's very difficult to mobilize stakeholders to achieve it. The role of governments in setting targets in many cases, isn't directly to invest themselves to achieve them. It's rather to mobilize either the private sector or individual citizens or communities to contribute in that investment towards achieving the target. So a fundamental component for the success of targets becomes ultimately the credibility of that target itself. So shifting now to some of the key findings before we wrap up and open up to questions. So the report obviously includes many more findings than we'll be able to cover here. So we've tried to pick some of the most important ones. But if you're interested in digging further, we encourage you to download the report and take a closer look, because there's quite a few more than we have time to get into here. One key finding is that governments are increasingly setting technology-specific targets as opposed to just general renewable energy targets. So we're seeing more and more jurisdictions having wind energy targets, solar PV targets, solar CSP targets, bioenergy targets, hydropower, geothermal targets. And that trend shows no sign of slowing down. So that's one key finding. The second is that the metrics in which renewable energy targets are set, whether it's in total tons of oil equivalent or in output terms or as a percentage, can have a significant impact and can have significant implications for monitoring, reporting, and ultimately for enforcement. So if you consider the example of some U.S. RPS targets, RPSs are effectively just one form of target that is legally binding and that has specific reporting requirements attached to them. So in the case of an RPS, the different utilities in a state are required to demonstrate by providing data to the regulator that they have met a minimum share of their total electricity sales from renewable energy. And they can do that by either purchasing electricity, generating it themselves, or in many cases by purchasing renewable energy certificates. But the basic principle is that each utility has to meet that specific requirement and report on that to the government. And whether in that case it's percentage-based or some specific output number matters, because the target is legally binding. And if the utility does not meet its legally binding obligation, it can be subject to penalties. So it's very important in those cases for the target to be very specific and very precise in its definition and what is actually being mandated as part of the target. Another point that becomes important is that targets are increasingly targeting the long term. If you look at some of the early targets, I mentioned briefly the acronym in Brazil in the 1970s, Iowa's original renewable energy target that it adopted in 1984. These targets had a very comparatively short horizon. They were based on dealing with immediate concerns and targeting the sort of short to medium term. A growing number of targets are long-term, 2030, 2040, 2050, and there's even some discussion in certain ministries around the world in major governments like China and India to really start doing energy planning up to 2100. So we're talking, at this point, 85 years into the future. But as was pointed out, it's important that those long-term targets can be anchored and are anchored with shorter-term goals, because otherwise it's very difficult to know whether you're on track or not. A final point that's worth underscoring is that making the targets binding matters. As I pointed out, the track record for targets that are binding is actually quite good. If you look at some of the key jurisdictions across the US, as well as the UK and the EU, as well as Canadian provinces, which a few of which also have binding targets, the record is actually quite strong. In other words, they've not only met their target, but they've met it on time. On the other hand, if you look at aspirational targets, so far, if you compare their level of achievement and whether they're on track or not, a far greater number of countries are not on track with aspirational targets. So it's important to put that into perspective. I think this is another area where much more analysis and research would be terrific to see. So some key lessons as we wrap up and open up to questions, and perhaps Gideon may want to add a few points at the end as well. But I think we can generally we'll be wrapping up shortly. Some of the key lessons. So effective targets should be connected to high-level national priorities and backed by a strong political commitment, and should be made binding. So there's at some level, if there's not political commitment, if there isn't a clear political will, it's unlikely that the target will be seen as credible by stakeholders, and therefore it's unlikely that the market will develop the kind of momentum needed to reach the target. A second point is that stakeholder engagement can be critical. Getting stakeholders involved, as was seen in the case of South Africa, can really play a significant role not only in improving the target or strengthening it, but also in spreading awareness about it and in mobilizing more stakeholders to contribute to it. So stakeholder engagement can play a significant role. The third point doesn't need to be mentioned again. I think I made that quite clear that the distinction between binding and mandatory and aspirational targets is significant. A further aspect that came out of the analysis as we were writing this report is that it's also important to consider who is actually obligated to reach the target. So in the case of, as I mentioned, in the case of RPSs in the US, the who is ultimately the utilities. So the utilities are mandated to meet a certain minimum share, and they have a legal obligation to do so. But in the case of Europe, or with the National Renewable Energy Action Plans, it's effectively the government itself that is taking on the obligation. So the question of who is obligated is significant and doesn't have any, there isn't a clear, it's not clear in some cases whether the target is imposed on the government or whether it's a specific regulator who's responsible for meeting the target and then reporting to government, or whether it's particular private sector actors like utilities in the case of RPSs. So I think that question also deserves a bit more attention around who is actually obligated to meet a renewable energy target. In the case of biofuels or bioenergy, transport-related fuels, as well as in the case of the heating sector, it's not clear that those questions have really been adequately answered. So it certainly deserves a closer analysis. Ultimately, striking the right balance between ambition and realism is critical. If a target is so ambitious that it doesn't appear to any stakeholders to be credible, then it's unlikely again that the market will be able to develop sufficiently in order to achieve it. On the other hand, a target shouldn't just be a reflection of the status quo or of sort of basic business as usual planning. Renewable energy targets ideally should require or should involve some level of ambition above and beyond business as usual. So in effect, in calculating targets, it's important to set what the business as usual is and then to distinguish the target from that. So if the business as usual trend in a country like Brazil is to have still 75% of the electricity mix from hydro in 2050, then in order to be meaningful, a renewable energy target should be ambitious above and beyond what that business as usual situation would be. The same would apply to Iceland with a significant geothermal mix in the power sector, or jurisdictions like Quebec that have a significant hydroelectricity in the mix. So in those cases, and for jurisdictions like that already have, that are blessed to have a large share of renewables in the mix, it's perhaps worth thinking more carefully into how renewable energy targets can be rolled out in other sectors, like the heating sector, as well as in the transport sector, in order to broaden the potential for growth and for new development in those sectors. And finally, it's important to point out, as Guylaine underscored as well, that targets alone are not enough. It's really important that the overarching structure of the target, whether it's binding or aspirational, whether it's technology specific or technology neutral, is backed by specific policies and specific measures in order to make sure that the target can be reached. One final set of thoughts as we lead up to discussions in the big negotiations in September, in November and December in Paris around the climate targets. So Guylaine and I, in thinking through the report and some of the lessons that we learned and some of the insights that we gained in doing this research, started to think through more carefully what lessons could be drawn for the climate policy debate. And in particular, keeping in mind how many governments are ultimately committing to both climate and renewable energy targets in order to move forward. So one key insight is that aspirational targets are unlikely to trigger any meaningful change. And I think that's clear regardless of the sector, and that's also clear even in the business sector for private companies that set targets. If it's just an aspirational goal without any follow-up, any specific policies or strategies attached, or without any obligation entailed, it's unlikely to really mobilize any significant change. So for the climate question, I think this really becomes a key message and a key take-home message, if you will, from the analysis of renewable energy targets. In order to be effective, a second key point is that targets have to be credible, and ideally they have to be binding in some way. Now, there are different ways of making targets binding, and there are also different kinds of bindingness, of obligation, if you will, in the design of targets. But generally, if they're going to be effective, they should be binding. I think in the debates leading up to climate negotiations, it still remains to be seen how targets internationally will be made binding nationally and subnationally. And I think this is another area that renewable energy targets may provide a valuable case study. The third point is that who is obligated and what legal basis of that obligation matters. So as I pointed out in the case of utilities with RPS policies and the target being specifically imposed on them, in the climate area, it's important to think through whether the obligation or the target is just generic for the jurisdiction as a whole, or whether it too has some substructure and some design. So whether there's the targets can be broken down into different subsectors, not only sort of agriculture and transport and so on, but also between different particular industries and even different particular power plants at the plant level, or even the utility level. So I think those kinds of questions can also shed light, and I think the renewable energy, the case of renewable energy targets can maybe provide some valuable insights there too. A fourth point is that targets are fundamentally about shaping overall expectations. And in that sense, targets need to be seen as a convincing example or convincing guide for the market to follow. If the targets aren't well designed or aren't sufficiently credible, they won't shape expectations. The goal is to have targets that have a meaningful role in shaping overall investor expectations. And I think in the case of climate change, in light of the hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of investment that we're going to need annually in low carbon infrastructure and renewable energy investment, this point around shaping expectations is really critical. And finally, as one of the lessons that I think stands out not only from the specific countries across the EU, but also from many other examples around the world, including China, India, Brazil, and Mexico, is that targets need to be backed by specific policies and measures in order to get anywhere. And I think at the end of the day, unless there is some specific strategy and policy articulation going on in conjunction with the targets, it's not clear that they can or will have any meaningful impact on the market. So with that, I think I will wrap up. I realize we're just a few minutes over the 1 hour mark. We can now open it up